All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Solomon. I am the executive director here at the museum. I'm very happy to be the director of the museum because I get to pick programs that I'm interested in. I'm fairly interested in chicken farmers in the area because we're very familiar with that with Farmingdale, Millstone, even Freehold. And so seeing the other side of Jersey, South Jersey, see them in Vineland area. And so we have Seth Stern here. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, so a very smarty pants. He is a legal journalist and editor of the Bloomberg Industry Group. He has a very close connection to this story as his grandparents lived on the farm, and will share his story and a little bit about his book. And so, I just want to remind people that I'm going to mute everyone. If you have a question, of course, you're more than welcome to unmute. But at this time, we're going to give our full attention to Seth, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end. All right.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for inviting me to speak, and thank you to all of you who took the time on a summer afternoon to participate. This book began nearly 25 years ago while home on Long Island studying for law school finals in December 1998. I visited my grandmother every afternoon and started asking her about her life over lunch. We talked about growing up in Lublin, Poland, surviving the war in an underground dugout in a forest, and coming to the US as refugees. You can see my grandparents and my mother pictured here on the Marine Perch, which is the former US troop transport that brought them to the United States in February 1947. My mom is the young girl in the dark hair, and my grandfather in the hat, and my grandmother next to her. In the years that followed, I visited Lublin and Belzec, the extermination camp where my grandparents' families were killed, and Bensheim, the town in Germany where they lived as displaced persons. But the part of her story that came to fascinate me most is how my grandparents and about 1,000 other survivors came to settle as poultry farmers in South Jersey. This is a personal story, and I explore in the book how my family and my grandmother's childhood friend, also pictured here, this is the family they shared a farm with. They shared this farm for many years and raised their daughters as twins. But it's also a broader story about how Jews came to be farmers in the United States and how survivors wound up in this unique South Jersey community anchored by Vineland, New Jersey, halfway between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Most Jewish immigrants in this country gravitated to big cities, but smaller numbers settled in rural America, whether Appalachia or Gold Rush, California, or the Mississippi Delta, where they started out as peddlers that then often opened dry goods stores. A few tried farming, often with the help of the Jewish Agricultural Society, funded by the philanthropist Baron Morris de Hirsch. In 1930s, Jews farmed in all 48 then existing states. To figure out how to farm, many turned to the Jewish Farmer, a monthly magazine published in English and Yiddish that started in the early 1900s, and it was still being published when the survivors started settling on South Jersey farms. The first big wave of Jewish farming came in the 1880s when idealistic Russian Jews tried establishing communal farming colonies throughout the US. Most failed spectacularly due to malaria, bad weather, the farmers' inexperience. The few that survived were in South Jersey, where they were close to big markets in New York and Philadelphia. In the early 20th century, the Jewish Agricultural Society largely gave up on colonies and focused on settling Jews on individual farms. They mostly concentrated in the northeastern US, from the Berkshires down through Connecticut, the Catskills, and into New Jersey. Speaking to this audience with an interest in Monmouth County history, it's important to note that your area is also central to the story of Jewish agriculture, as Jessica alluded to, with Farmingdale being one of the largest Jewish farm settlements, along with Lakewood and Toms River a little further south. In all, about 1,200 Jewish farmers lived in and around those three communities. Throughout New Jersey, the form of farming that tended to work out best for the Jewish farmers was chicken farming. It required less capital, it was less physically demanding, and it required less land. So when the first Jewish refugees to make it out of Germany arrived during the Depression, The Jewish Agricultural Society saw poultry farming as a great solution, particularly at a time when Jewish refugees were seen to be taking urban Americans' jobs to settle them on farms that people otherwise may not have been wanting to buy seemed ideal. And they particularly looked to South Jersey as a great place because farms were cheaper there than in other previously more populated farming communities like Farmingdale. That helps explain why, even though some of the refugee farmers settled in Monmouth and Ocean counties, many more wound up in South Jersey. There was an influx of refugee farmers in and around Vineland, this city of 30,000 people. As this photo of Vineland's Main Street Landis Avenue from that era shows, it looks like many small towns with a Woolworth, Sears, a Pontiac dealer, but it also was uniquely laid out with glass and clothing factories mingling with farms. The descendants of the original Italian immigrants grew fruits and vegetables on truck farms, and Jewish farmers raised chickens. To give you a sense of what these farms looked like in this era, they might have been about 10 acres on average, with about 3,000 birds total. And you could see this is a shot of inside one of the coops. Most of the farmers were egg farmers, but some of them also were raising the chickens for meat. In this era, when poultry was king in Vineland, the high school dubbed its football team the Poultry Clan, and the city hosted a poultry festival that boasted the world's largest frying pan, pictured here. There were dozens of hatcheries and feed mills, a world-renowned poultry vaccine maker, many of which were Jewish-owned, including Rubinoff's feed mill, where most survivors bought their chicken feed. It was also a community with an unusually large Jewish presence. I'd mentioned earlier how Jews had always settled in rural America, but by the 1950s, most of these rural Jewish communities had shrunk as Jews, like everyone else in rural America, had started moving to cities or onto suburbs. But in Vineland, thanks to the descendants of the original farm colony settlers and the German refugees that followed, had already built a remarkably robust Jewish community with synagogues, kosher bakeries, butcher shops, and delis like this one, Goldstein's Delicatessen, which everyone remembered the great pastrami that they would get there. In the 1950s, Manischewitz opened a plant there where they manufactured borscht and gefilte fish. The survivors who heard about Vineland largely through word of mouth would further enrich this Jewish community and make it their own. They built stiebels or small shuls, often with their own hands within walking distance of their farms. This is the one with the Hebrew name for the surviving remnant that was on the same block as my grandparents' farm. This is a favorite picture of mine when congregants at the stiebel celebrated the arrival of their Torah outside, my grandfather's holding the staff in the front. They created the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, a Landsmannschaft, or combination mutual aid society and social club, like the ones earlier generations of immigrants established in big cities. Their Farband, the Yiddish word for association as they called it, held events in Yiddish and English, hosting stars of the Yiddish stage, comedians, poets, and journalists who, like the farmers, were basically also refugees, and they performed wherever the remnants of Eastern European Jewry had settled. And in Vineland, they performed before standing room only crowds at the local junior high school or high school. The Jewish Poultry Farmers Association also hosted dinner dances for the adults and all sorts of events for the kids, including this Lag BaOmer bonfire in 1955. They also commemorated what would later become known as the Holocaust. I try to show in the book that the survivors weren't a monolith. They varied widely in how much success they had, how observant they were, how they dealt with the trauma they'd experienced. And I'd be happy to talk more about any of those themes or those dimensions in the question and answer. Many of the surviving farmers had very warm memories of their lives there, while others hated every minute of rural life. This is a photo my mother still has on a shelf at her home. It's of her and her friend who grew up on the farm together for several years, holding baby chicks, and it sort of reminds her every day of the idyllic childhood on the farm. But it was also a hard life, and these farmers were at the mercy of the weather, chickens' health, and the markets, Birds were nasty. Their waste smelled. They attacked each other. The farmers had to wake up early and could never take a vacation because the chickens had to eat, and you had to make sure their water was okay every morning. In October 1954, Hurricane Hazel destroyed the coops, including this one, and killed thousands of birds. In hindsight, the lucky ones might have been those who used their insurance proceeds from the damaged farms to start another business or leave the area altogether. They had entered egg farming at the worst possible moment when small family farms were finding it increasingly difficult to compete with mega farms in the South that had much lower labor costs and could support 50,000 or 100,000 and ultimately a million birds. As the 1960s progressed, they found it increasingly hard to make a living, and many began to abandon their farms or South Jersey altogether to find better work. My grandparents and mother stayed until after she graduated high school there in 1964. In the decades that followed, nearly every farm ceased operating in South Jersey, or at least every Jewish-owned poultry farm. And the Jewish community began to shrink, just as similar rural communities had already contracted almost everywhere else in rural America. I hope I have helped preserve their story in this book and give some sense of what a unique place this was in that era. I also had a more selfish motive in dedicating a good chunk of the last quarter century to this project. If nothing else, I hope my college-age niece and nephew, who got to know my grandmother before she died in 2014, will read this book one day. And one day, I also hope my 7-year-old son, Ezra, who was born a year after she died, will learn about this story and perhaps share it with his children one day. This is a picture of him at when he was about a year old at a exhibit at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia about the Jewish farming presence in New Jersey. Thank you all for listening. I realize many of you have your own connections, perhaps, to the Jewish farming communities in New Jersey, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, I'm just gonna, let's see. All right. If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand or unmute, and you're more than welcome to ask, and then I'll answer some of mine as well. Cantor?
Oh, I'm very excited to hear this, and it was a very wonderful, educated lecture, and I appreciate it. I've been the cantor of the synagogue in Toms River since 1973.
Oh, wow.
And also another person who is on right now, Ernie, is directly related, and I still know his wonderful mother. I hope that Ernie will speak a little bit too, but I knew a number of the remaining chicken farmers and purchased eggs from them. Still have the memories in the 1970s up to maybe around 1980. And I've also visited websites and read books of other historians telling about the Jewish chicken farms of New Jersey. And but I think that Dr. Stern, you've done a wonderful job explaining everything, and I'm looking forward to reading your book, and hopefully you might be able to make your script available to us as a summary. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Ernie, I think he put you on a hot spot, so I think you have to go next.
Well, I'm very interested in this subject also. My grandparents, I guess, came from Germany, and I guess a Jewish federation put them on a chicken farm in Toms River. My father volunteered to be in the army when he was young then. And when he came back, he built Castle Woodcraft, which may have been mentioned in the book, somebody told me. And that's my business still. And the chicken coops have all been torn down behind where that is. But I grew up when I was 10, 11. I used to collect eggs on my aunt's chicken farm there. They had, I don't know, 10,000 chickens at one time. Everything you said about the smell, all the neighbors complained. Uh, we managed to have manure for our farm, for our gardens, which are plentiful. And life was hard for, it was my father's sister then that kept the farm into the 60s. And I used to hear the stories about how the price of eggs was down. And I felt like they worked very hard. And just as you said, the chickens would get sick and they worked all the time. And I guess that the day that they sold off the chickens was probably a happy day for my aunt. Um, and I've stayed in the neighborhood. We used to go to the synagogue where the Cantor Green was the Cantor. And growing up, there were a lot of chicken farmers there. And of course, now there's none. Um, but my memories of those days are very sweet, and my story sounds very similar to yours, I guess.
Yeah, I should have said in my introductory comments about the title of the book, Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, and that comes from the idea that in oral history interviews, so many of the farmers would say that part of the appeal of becoming a farmer was that the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them. And part of that was a joke, and part of that was a reality, because when they came here, if they were German refugees before the U.S. entered the war, or later the survivors who came after the war, they came with very little money. They had, in often cases, particularly those after the war, their educations were interrupted. They didn't speak English. They didn't have very good prospects for a job, and at a time when the military was demobilizing and all the people who were in the military were coming home to civilian jobs. And so farming was a very appealing prospect to a lot of them. The idea of being your own boss after years of captivity, the ability to, that you didn't need to know English well. And a lot of them didn't know the first thing about farming. So they had very unrealistic expectations of what it was going to be like. And the difficult life ahead, they didn't necessarily realize it, though, given how much they had endured during the war. It wasn't like they didn't know from hardship, but they didn't necessarily have realistic expectations of what a farm life was going to be like.
I just want to put this one question out and then I'll go to you, Roberta. Someone asked if any of the farms can still be visited. And so in Vineland, not really. But in Monmouth County, there's quite a few that you can visit. One being the Green Chicken Farm. It's on Squonkam Yellowbrook Road in Farmingdale. And then there's a few in Lakewood as well. I just don't have the name on top of my head, but a larger problem in South Jersey, which Seth can also continue on, is a lot of them moved out of rural areas and went to Philadelphia suburbs and kind of went away with farming, respectively chicken farming.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the trajectory was that people, as the 50s and particularly as the 60s went on, they left farming. Some of them stayed in Vineland and opened small businesses, and others, some went to Atlantic City and opened motels, and they just, or elsewhere. They tended to gravitate more to cities, New York or Philadelphia. Now, there's the question I've thought about and been asked about. I mean, even if farming hadn't gone terribly, if the sort of economics didn't work out, would they have continued, or would a second generation have taken over in these farms? And I don't think so, because a lot of these survivors, like other American Jews, had sort of aspirations for their children that they go on to college, enter professions, become entrepreneurs, and that's the trajectory they took. So I don't think even if the farms were successful, many of them would have encouraged their children to take them over, and this would have been a multi-generational that you would even today see South Jersey dotted with Jewish-owned farms.
And then Roberta, you can unmute yourself before. Okay.
Both of my grandparents on my mother's side and father's side came from Russia. So they weren't Holocaust survivors, but they both ended up having farms. My mother's side, they came from Russia, went to Canada, went to New York. It was the Depression. And my grandmother said, if we have a farm, at least we can feed the children. And so they had chickens and pigeons and a cow and a horse. And he was like Tevye, and he'd bring milk and eggs to the hotels in Lakewood. It took him a day on his wagon. And my father was raised in New York, but saw the farm as an opportunity. Some people were telling Jewish farmers that your wife can sit on the porch and eat strawberries and sour cream all day long. Of course, that was a big joke. But my parents had the farm until the competition from Maryland became too severe from Purdue and the other large companies. And then they both went back to college and took other careers on. But they had the farm. My father had wanted to be a doctor, but there was no money for it. And so he bred chickens, raised hatching eggs, raised eggs for selling as eggs, not so much meat, and had the farm until, I guess, the late 50s, when the whole farming business, that was in Jackson. So there were a number of Jewish farmers in Jackson as well. And my grandparents, one set was in Toms River and the other set was in Jackson with us. And it was a nice life from my point of view, although not so social, but it was unique and healthy. And I worked hard collecting the eggs and packing the eggs and washing the eggs and all of that stuff. But it's really good. I was hoping to meet you in person because my husband's cousin is Josh Block.
Oh, that's so funny.
And he had told me about your book
Yes.
originally before it even came out.
Yeah.
So I did want to send regards to you that way.
Well, thank you so much for joining. And I should say, yeah, the idea that this was hardly only a phenomenon of Holocaust survivors, of the pre-war German refugees. The Jewish Agricultural Society helped settle all Jews of all kinds, immigrants, people who came right off the boat, people who had been in cities and were dissatisfied with urban life and wanted to try something different. So it was a more universal. It was always a small number of Jewish immigrants who wound up on farms, but this was certainly, and they wound up all over. There were Jewish farmers in South Dakota and Jewish farmers in Kentucky, but the greatest concentration really was in the Northeast. And you mentioned the isolation. It really was an isolating life for individual farmers, particularly in a place like if you were in North Dakota on hundreds of acres and your nearest might be a mile away or more. Whereas the poultry farmers had the benefit of relatively compact plots, and so you could be closer together and be in a community like the one I focus on in Vineland, where you were closer to people. It was still somewhat isolating, but it was more of a community, and you can more easily have a minyan if you were observant and you weren't going to walk on Shabbat, and you could build a shtibel in the neighborhood and pray with other farmers. So
yeah, there were a lot of them in Jackson, little tiny groups where the farmers could get together. And I know there was a shul within walking distance of us. One of the farmers donated a little building on their property, Sokol, their name was, and we had a shul there for the high holidays. Shabbos, it was kind of hard to get a minyan, but the holidays we always did. So anyway, it was very nice. I ordered your book and I'm looking forward to reading it.
well, thank you very much.
Great. I do have a question for you. And so, like I said earlier to you, that oral history is something the museum is working on right now. How did you acquire your oral histories? And did you get a lot of connections between families? Did you get one oral history, meet a family, and then have to go find that family? And just really, how long did it really take for you to scout out these families, contact, and then acquire these oral histories?
Sure. I mean, I approached this sort of as a journalist and as a historian, and I started by interviewing my grandmother and my mother and branched out to people that they knew, and simultaneously started looking for other sources. The Jewish Federation in Cumberland County, which is where Vineland is located, had the foresight to do an oral history project with about a dozen of the farmer, both the German refugees and the post-war arrivals, around 2002. So by that time they were older, but thankfully they and most of them are no longer alive. But they collected that, so I had that resource, and then so many of the interviews done by the Shoah Foundation and the Holocaust Museum and other organizations. So I was able to go through dozens of oral histories that were more geared toward the war years, but people would also reference their experience on the farms. I did myself probably about 80 to 90 interviews of people, more so the children of survivors than the survivors themselves who had passed, and also other people in the Vineland area in South Jersey who had been involved in poultry farming or had memories of that era.
And then I want you to go into the dichotomy between the Holocaust survivors and the American Jewish community. Were kind of almost like polar opposites within Vineland.
It was a very complex relationship that I tried to lay out. You had these different communities within the Jewish community, and one was almost, you could think about it like the establishment. These were the descendants of the original Eastern European colony settlers who had come in the 1880s and 1890s, and by the 1950s they were second, third generation. Some of them were Ivy League educated. The founder of the Vineland Poultry Labs, which was an international poultry vaccine manufacturer, and he was the Goldhalf family. They were sort of pillars of the Jewish community, and there were other examples, and they were sort of the establishment, and they had built the establishment synagogues. And then you had the German refugees. When they came in the late 30s and early 40s, they didn't necessarily feel welcome. And they largely kept to themselves, which was consistent with other places, whether it Washington Heights in New York or Binghamton, where some settled as cattle farmers. They also tended to keep to themselves. And that was held true also with the post-war. When the survivors came, a lot of them remembered feeling unwelcome, that the German Jews and the earlier generations just weren't very welcoming to them. And whether that was because the earlier arrivals still felt insecure about their status in America and didn't like these newcomers with their funny accents and reminding other Americans that the Jews weren't fully American, or whether it was a function of the survivors' sense of insecurity and they just didn't feel comfortable among others and just kept to themselves. But that was the dynamic. That's why they formed their own association, the Landsmannschaft, and largely, but not entirely, they socialized among themselves, at least initially. Some of those differences broke down over time with the children of my mother's generation, for instance, where her friends in high school were German Jews, and some of the people that I interviewed joked that they intermarried because they later married an American-born Jew. So some of that broke down over time, and as the community began to shrink, it wasn't possible to have a German Jewish Stiebel and the Hungarian Jews keep to themselves. It just wasn't possible to support so many segmented institutions. So some of that also broke down over time that way. But it was complex, and the survivors really didn't feel welcome. And whether that was in their own minds or the reality of the situation, it's hard to tease out so many decades later.
Yeah. I'm going to take some questions. Any questions from our audience members?
I have a couple of other things just to mention. At our synagogue in Toms River, that it is actually an offshoot of the original Toms River community of Jewish farmers. And our synagogue congregation, B'nai Israel, still exists. And it was built across the street from the community of Jewish farmers on 2 poultry farms. The land was formerly 2 poultry farms. And one of the things that our synagogue did some years ago, we got a new set of Torah mantles for our Torah scrolls. And one of them deliberately was embroidered with a large basket filled with eggs. And we still have it.
That's great.
When you were doing research, did you see that the Jewish Agricultural Society worked with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to get these families over, or was it they were sponsored by other farmers coming here? I know on page 51, you talk about how the Jewish Agricultural Society was like, stop mentioning to your friends how great it is to farm. You only did it for like 1 or 2 years, just wait and then get back to them. So I found that really interesting, and that how that changes so drastically. And I just wanted to see if HIAS
Yeah.
had a lot to do with that
But
too.
there were two, so HIAS, and there was another organization, and it was the one that helped my grandparents. It was called United Service for New Americans, and they've eventually merged, and HIAS is the entity. But so those were the two organizations that would help the refugee. They were called at the time displaced persons.
Encounter anti-Semitism.
If they were in camps, displaced person camps in the American or British or other zones of occupation in Germany, where a lot of them fled after the war, and they would wait for a visa. It took a long time for a lot of them because there were quotas that only began to be lifted in 48 and 50. So some of these displaced persons had to wait in Europe for a long time. My grandparents were quite fortunate that they got going in 47. And so they would come over to the US, and the HIAS or USNA would help them with the initial settlement, but it wasn't a long-term support. And so they had to figure out a way to make a living. And then largely through word of mouth, it would be someone you met in a DP camp, or you might have known a distant relation, or back in before the war, you'd hear, hey, I'm settling on a farm, and they tended to talk it up and make it sound great. And somebody mentioned the notion of, just eating strawberries. That it was this idea, oh, you're just going to make a fortune farming. And that was the game of telephone, and people would come down to Vineland, and it looked green and lush, and you had 10 acres to yourself, and you were living in a walk up in the Bronx, and it just seemed so appealing. It's so that was sort of the word of mouth network by which people farmed, and it frustrated, as you said, the officials who were trying to manage this flow. The unrealistic expectations were building up, and the people who had only farmed a few months or a year were talking like experts to the other Jews back in New York, and it created very unrealistic expectations of what it was going to be like.
There's quite a few farming societies. There was the Jewish farming society called Jersey Homesteads, which is now Roosevelt, New Jersey, and it was during the Great Depression. FDR, under the New Deal Agency, decided that he wanted to make homesteads in the area. After like 4 years, the people were like, we don't like farming. We don't want to grow potatoes anymore. And such a different background too, especially some of these Holocaust survivors were in cities and then going and then farming and never even imagining like to cut 10 acres of grass and aspects like that. And so you see that still today when people come to America and they're like, it's fine, we're gonna make so much money, it's gonna be so easy, and they're like, no, it's almost like false hope. You talk about survivor search, and I found that like an interesting term, because we see that a lot too, where from HIAS and all these other organizations getting them through, you see this uptick of immigration, especially in New Jersey, and all they can get are these, rentals or boarding houses on the farms and working there. But ultimately, it also led to them having kibbutzes in Israel. It trained them, heck, a lot's training farms too in Cambridge.
So yeah, there were training farms, and there was definitely a migration, including in the Vineland area, where people sort of learned how to farm and then would move to Israel. And the truth is, a lot of the survivors, there wasn't that much. The people who had come over, many of them had thought about going to what was then Palestine and then Israel, but it didn't work out. And in my grandparents' case, they had a young child. The thought of being at a British detention camp on Cyprus, which was where a lot of the Jewish refugees were being intercepted and directed wasn't an appealing prospect. And so they had considered Israel or Palestine and instead opted for the US. And so they had sort of given up on that idea by the time they came to the US. So the training farms that were in the Vineland area tended to be more American-born Jews who would go there and learn how to farm and move to Israel. That said, the survivor farmers in the Vineland area very strongly identified with farmers in Israel. They had fundraisers to buy equipment for Israeli farms. Some of the survivors talked about what they were doing, the equivalent to a moshav, which was the moshavim, which was a slightly less egalitarian than the kibbutz collective form of farming. So they identified with the Israeli agricultural movement, but for a lot of them, it wasn't their ultimate dream. They'd sort of given up on that by the time they came to the farms in New Jersey.
We have a question from Ron. He said, did these farming communities tend to be more religious or secular?
I would say that's one of the aspects of the variation that I try to explore in the book, where you had tremendous variation in religious observance. I think they identified strongly as Jewish, and even in the case of people who may have lost faith due to their wartime experiences, still identified and with as Jews, and whether that manifested itself as Zionism. My grandparents, they lived right near a shtibel, and my mom remembered it was very difficult to get my grandfather to attend very often because he had lost faith. And there were others who had lost everything. They'd lost every relative, they'd lost children, and they came here and they built shtibels. And they one man profiled in the Vineland newspaper had dug the Torah he had hidden in a forest, brought it to the US, and the most important thing in the world for him was having a minyan on his farm on the high holidays. So you had that tremendous range. There were fewer very observant Jews on the farm in like Orthodox. That tended to be rarer. There were only a few that I came across where they, one family where they were covering their hair, the daughters, and wearing long clothes, and other people in the area sort of were wondering what they didn't understand the customs, the non-Jews that those people were engaged in. So that tended to be more unusual.
And then any questions? Linda?
I have, let Linda go first.
Yes, Seth, have you been to the farm, or was it gone before?
Oh, yeah, it was long gone. I mean, my grandparents and mother left in 1964, and I first visited Vineland in 2004. So it was 40 years later. By then, almost all of the remnants of the farming presence were gone. There were still some silos where the feed had been stored, and there were some abandoned coops, but most of them were sort of almost like wreckage at that point. So there's very little left of the farming presence in South Jersey.
What is on the property now of your grandparents' farm?
It's still, the home is still there. I never sort of tried knocking and asking for a tour, but the house is still there, and it looks very similar to what it looked like when my grandparents lived there, but the coops were gone.
Yeah.
No more chickens. Although when I walked down the street, someone had a chicken on the block. I think it was a one or two. There weren't 3,000 behind the house.
Yeah, my relatives were not from the Holocaust. They came over in the early 1900s. They were from Odessa, Russia, and this was my grandmother's sister. They ran a saloon in Hoboken, and then from Hoboken, they decided to get out of the city. And probably around 1930, they went to Lakewood, and they had a chicken farm on River Avenue, which was Route 9. I remember like maybe 1962. Must have been 7. I don't know if the Garden State Parkway was built. I just don't remember. I remember like a dirt road kind of thing, but maybe the parkway, I think, was already partially built.
Parkway was built 1954.
Yeah, so I must have been on it. And they then kept it going. So they were probably there from 1930. And then my father's cousin, that side of the family stayed probably till about 1994, and then they sold.
Wow.
But they weren't operating. I
Mhm.
don't believe they were operating. One of the husbands, I think it was more my grandmother's generation, like you were saying, were operators, and then the next generations was still living on the property.
Right.
I remember the coops being there, but I think one of the men was a postal worker, so
Mhm.
it was just, and then they were able to sell out when everybody was buying property down in Lakewood. And I think they probably sold in 94, like I said. I will get your book.
Thank you. That, I mean, what you're describing was typical in terms of 1930. The Depression had started, and farming again looked pretty appealing at a time when other businesses were failing. And I think someone already mentioned you could feed your family, if nothing else, you'd at least have some food. So that was not unusual among American Jews in that era.
Okay, Cantor Green.
Well, some other things that I wanted to share about my congregation, B'nai Israel, that we were founded in 1950, before my time, as an offshoot to the Toms River Jewish community, Toms River community of Jewish farmers, because there was some conflict that arose among the members there of the community of Jewish farmers, because mostly they were secular. A number of them were socialists and communists. And so around late 1940s, there became a movement for some kind of religious observance. They wanted to have, these new people wanted to have a rabbi. They wanted to have a place for their children to learn about Judaism, where they wouldn't have to go by horse and wagon to Lakewood to get a Jewish education. So that was the primary reason for the founding of our congregation in 1950. The building was actually built in 1959, and the original Toms River community of Jewish farmers became a Reform temple, and that eventually merged and became Temple Beth Am Shalom in Lakewood. And the original building now is a Christian church.
What you mentioned, the sort of division, the divide there between the secular and the more sort of
Yes.
ideological or socialist or left leaning folks. I mean, you had that in both. I think that existed in the Toms River and Lakewood, Farmingdale, and then you also had the same phenomenon in Petaluma community in Northern California, where there was a Jewish poultry farming presence. There were similar divisions. And this really didn't exist in Vineland. And as far as I could tell, the reason why is some of the people with those sort of political or ideological motivations had tended to come in the 20s and 30s and settle on farms or into the 40s. And the survivors just didn't have that. If they had whatever sort of political leanings they might have had or ideological fervor, by the time they settled on farms, they just were trying to make a living, start a family. They weren't getting into the ideological battles of the left. So that just didn't play out the same way in South Jersey as it did in the other communities and also in Petaluma. During the Red Scare era, there was also real divisions, and the FBI came by and investigated some of the farmers. And so that only, I think, added to the distrust and divisions in some of those communities.
I have another question from Ron. It says, were the surrounding communities welcoming to the Jewish farmers or perhaps more tolerant or accepting?
I think the same when I talked about the variation in the Jewish community, there was also sort of a nuance with the non-Jews. It tended in South Jersey, it was Italian American, second or third generation. And there was a real range. Some people remembered experiencing anti-Semitism, kids experiencing taunts, dead animals thrown on their property, and feeling unwelcome. And at the same time, there was a lot of examples of generosity. And one of the Italian American farmers would take the children of a Jewish farmer to the hospital in Philadelphia for treatment, and would take one of the survivors that he knew, take his animals to get slaughtered in a kosher manner, or take the farmer's wife to be able to say Yortzeit at the synagogue. So it was a mix of both welcoming and feeling some measure of hostility at times. There were instances of crosses being burned on lawns, at least in a couple instances. And the local newspaper, the Vineland Times-Journal, was owned by a Jewish family, the Leuchters, and an American-born Jew, Ben Leuchter, was very vocal in the paper, speaking out against those instances of anti-Semitism and the cross burnings, and saying, you know, it's a terrible thing, and it's a particularly terrible thing to do that in a place where you have these refugees, given what they've experienced. So he just had tremendous empathy and wrote about the survivors with great compassion. In an era in the 50s when there's this notion that the survivors were kind of ignored, and the reality in Vineland, at least, they weren't ignored in that way.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'd like to give another example of how former chicken farmers were supportive of land and farming in Israel. So in our congregation in Toms River, for many, many years, we supported the Jewish National Fund, Keren Kayemet LeYisrael. And not only did we support them, but it was done in a special way. We had an annual fundraiser, and they considered it so important that they called it the Third Seder. And every spring, I think several weeks after Passover had passed over, we had the Third Seder. It was a very, very large fundraising event to completely dedicated to support the Jewish National Fund for, you know, the land and everything agricultural in Israel.
Great. Thank you so much. If there's no more questions, I just want to thank Seth for meeting with us today. It's been such a delight reading his book. I just reread it, and it's just great collective memory. You'll see similarities between people who lived on chicken farms in Central Jersey compared to Vineland. I also want to say Baron de Hirsch Fund, there is a museum in Woodbine. It's called the Woodbine, Sam Aziz Woodbine Jewish Museum. And it's one of the synagogues that, not the Vineland community, but closer to Atlantic City. And they share similar, bring back to the soil movement, and start really talking about why people immigrated here and how they started farming. And this book is a great reference as well. I just love the importance of Jewish institutions that he used. He utilized so many organizations, and that's what we're here for. We're here, museums and all these federations are meant to have these collective memories shared. So I appreciate everyone sharing their memories with us today on this talk, and I appreciate Seth so much. And so I just want to do a quick little round of applause for him. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for listening and asking such good questions.
Jessica, can you send us all contact information, such as Mr. Stern's email address?
If you're comfortable with that.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. And I will. And this will also be recorded. So if you want to share with your friends and family, it'll be on our YouTube, hopefully end of next week. But don't hold me to that. All right. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a